The silence in my apartment was a physical thing, thick and heavy like dust motes in a sunbeam. It settled on the worn-out armchair, coated the spines of the few books I owned, and filled the spaces between the quiet hum of the old refrigerator. My life had become a study in quietness, an ordered landscape of solitude I had built for myself after everything fell apart. I spent my days carving small, intricate things from scraps of wood, gears that would never turn, tiny birds that would never fly. It was a way to keep my hands busy, to feel the muscle memory of a skill that once defined me, a skill that had belonged to a life I no longer had. I was a restorer by trade, or I had been. Now I just restored my own sense of calm, one sliver of wood at a time. My routine was the scaffolding that held me up. Coffee at 7, a walk through the historic district by 8. I always took the same route, past the grand old houses with their manicured lawns and wraparound porches. I never felt envy, only a kind of detached appreciation, as if I were looking at paintings in a museum. There was one house in particular, a slate blue Victorian with white trim, set back from the road behind a low stone wall. It belonged to Mr. Arthur Gray. I didn't know him, not really, but in a town this size, you knew of people. He was a quiet pillar of the community, a retired architect whose name was on the bronze plaque of the restored library. I'd see him sometimes at the farmer's market, his silver hair catching the light, his posture straight and steady. He had a face that looked like it had seen a great deal, but had chosen to hold on to stillness instead of sorrow. There was a gravity to him that pulled at my attention. It was in the way he listened, truly listened, when the baker told him about the new rye bread, his head tilted slightly, his gaze focused. It was in the careful way his hands, large and marked with the faint lines of age, selected a tomato from a vendor's stall. He moved with a deliberate economy, a man who wasted no motion and no words. I kept a polite distance, an anonymous observer in the background of his well-ordered life. My attraction to him was a secret I kept even from myself, a low, warm hum beneath the surface of my careful days. It was safe precisely because it was impossible. He was a landmark I was just passing through. One Tuesday, the catalyst arrived not with a bang, but in the smudged ink of the local community newsletter I picked up at the coffee shop. Tucked between an announcement for a bake sale and a plea for library volunteers was a small notice. Piano tuner needed. The Charity League was hosting a benefit concert in 2 weeks, and the venue was a private residence. The notice listed the address. It was the slate blue house on the hill. Mr. Arthur Gray's house. My breath caught in my chest. The pay was fair, more than fair, enough to ease the familiar knot of financial anxiety in my stomach for a month. But it wasn't the money that made my heart beat a little faster. It was the idea of stepping over that threshold, of being invited into the quiet world I had only ever observed from the outside. My past life, the one with the bustling workshop and the partner who left, had been filled with the sounds of restoration. I'd worked on antique clocks, music boxes, and yes, pianos. My hands knew the feel of felt hammers and taut steel strings. The skill was still there, dormant but not gone. I folded the newsletter, the cheap paper crinkling in my suddenly damp palm. A current of something that felt dangerously like hope flickered inside me. It was a risk. To step out of my quiet routine was to make myself visible, to invite scrutiny. But to stay hidden felt, for the first time in a long time, like a different kind of risk. The risk of letting my world shrink until there was nothing left but me and the silent, wooden birds. I went home and typed out a short, professional email. I listed my experience, attached a reference from a client from years ago, and quoted a price. I read it over a dozen times, my finger hovering over the send button. It felt like standing on the edge of a high dive. I closed my eyes, took a shallow breath, and clicked. Then I shut my laptop and tried not to think about it. For the rest of the day, the silence in my apartment felt different. It was no longer a heavy blanket. It was the held breath before a note is played. The reply came the next morning. It was from him. The email was brief, polite, and to the point. Mr. Miller, your qualifications are impressive. The piano is an old upright and has not been serviced in some time. Your quote is acceptable. When would be a good time for you to begin? The name on the email was simply, Arthur Gray, my name is Leo. Leo Miller. Seeing my name in a message from him felt strangely significant, a small anchor in the vast sea of my anonymity. We arranged for me to start the following afternoon. The impossible had just become very, very real. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of low-grade panic, cleaning my tools, pressing my best work shirt, and rehearsing polite, professional greetings in my head. When I finally stood on his porch the next day, my toolkit feeling like a lead weight in my hand, I almost turned back. The house was even more impressive up close. The paint was pristine, the windows spotless. It spoke of care and attention to detail. Before my nerve could fail me completely, the heavy oak door swung open. Arthur Gray stood in the doorway. He was taller than I had realized, and the quiet dignity I'd observed from afar was even more pronounced in person. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark trousers, comfortable but neat. The lines around his eyes crinkled slightly as he looked at me, a gaze that was assessing but not unkind. It held a surprising warmth. "Leo Miller?" he asked. His voice was a low baritone, a calm, steady sound that seemed to absorb the frantic beating of my own heart. "Yes, Mr. Gray. It's a pleasure to meet you." My voice came out a little thinner than I'd hoped. "The pleasure is mine. And please, call me Arthur." He stepped back, holding the door wider. "Come in." I stepped over the threshold and into his world. The air inside was cool and smelled of old wood, lemon oil, and the faint, comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The foyer was spacious, a grand staircase curving up to the second floor. Everything was immaculate, but not sterile. It felt lived in, a home, not just a house. He led me through an arched doorway into a large room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A library. In the center of the room, nestled between two tall windows that looked out onto a sprawling garden, was the piano. It was a beautiful old thing, its dark walnut case worn to a soft patina in places. It looked sturdy, reliable, much like the man who owned it. Arthur gestured toward it. "This is the patient," he said, a hint of dry humor in his tone. It was my wife's. It has been silent for too long. The simple statement was heavy with unspoken history. I felt a pang of sympathy, a connection to the quiet loss contained in his words. "It's a lovely instrument," I said, running my hand gently over the smooth, cool wood of the lid. "I'll take good care of it." He gave me a small, slow nod, his eyes lingering on my hand for a fraction of a second before meeting mine again. "I have no doubt you will." He then showed me to a small desk in the corner. "I'll be working in here for most of the day. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." With that, he settled into a large leather armchair with a book, leaving me to my work. The space he created for me was one of quiet welcome. He was present, but not imposing. I opened my toolkit and laid out my instruments on a soft cloth. The familiar ritual calmed me. As I began the delicate work of assessing the piano's condition, I was acutely aware of him in the room. I could hear the soft rustle of a page turning, the quiet sigh as he shifted in his chair. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was filled with a low, humming tension. I focused on the task at hand, on the feel of the tuning hammer in my palm, the precise turn of a pin, the swelling of a single, clear note in the quiet room. My work became a kind of meditation, a way to channel my nervous energy into something productive. The piano was badly out of tune, as I'd expected, but the bones of it were good. The wood was sound, the action responsive. As I worked my way up the keyboard, bringing each string back to its proper pitch, I could feel Arthur's occasional glance. It wasn't the impatient look of a client waiting for a job to be done. It was something else, something more curious and watchful. The weight of his gaze was a tangible thing on the back of my neck, warm and unsettling. After about an hour, he rose from his chair. I tensed, expecting a question or a comment on my progress. Instead, he walked quietly out of the room. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The brief release of tension made me aware of how tightly wound I was. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a small tray. On it were 2 glasses of iced water, condensation beading on their sides, and a small plate of shortbread cookies. He set the tray down on a low table near the piano bench. "You should stay hydrated," he said simply. "And my housekeeper, Maria, insists that no one can work properly without her shortbread." His expression was neutral, but his eyes held that same quiet warmth. It was a simple gesture, a common courtesy, but it felt like more. It felt like care. It was an act of quiet hospitality that acknowledged my presence not just as a hired hand, but as a person in his home. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, my voice softer this time, more my own. "That's very kind of you." He just nodded and returned to his chair. I took a sip of the cold water, the chill of it a welcome shock. I ate one of the cookies. It was buttery and melted on my tongue. As I turned back to the piano, I felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The professional distance I had tried to erect between us had been breached, not by anything overt, but by a glass of water and a cookie. It was a small kindness, but in the sparse landscape of my life, it felt monumental. I spent the next few hours lost in the intricate world of the piano. The work was absorbing, demanding my full attention. Each note I brought into tune was a small victory, a piece of harmony restored to the silent room. Occasionally, I would play a short chord, listening to the way the notes blended, the overtones ringing in the air. During one of these pauses, I glanced over at Arthur. He wasn't reading. His book was resting in his lap, his head tilted back against the chair, his eyes closed. I thought he might be sleeping, but his posture was too alert. He seemed to be listening, truly listening, to the music I was slowly coaxing from the old instrument. Seeing him like that, unguarded and still, I allowed myself to really look at him. The silver at his temples shone in the afternoon light filtering through the windows. The lines on his face weren't just signs of age. They were maps of a life lived, of laughter and concentration and, I suspected, of deep grief. There was a strength in his features, a solidness that I found myself drawn to. He was a man who knew who he was. I, on the other hand, felt like a collection of spare parts, still trying to figure out how to put myself back together. He must have sensed my gaze, because his eyes opened slowly. They met mine across the room. He didn't look startled or annoyed at being watched. He just looked, his expression unreadable but intense. A slow heat crept up my neck. I felt exposed, as if he could see right through my professional veneer to the lonely, yearning man beneath. I quickly looked away, my focus snapping back to the keyboard, my fingers fumbling for a moment on the cool ivory. I struck a dissonant chord by accident, the jarring sound echoing my own internal state. I expected a comment, perhaps a teasing one, but there was only silence. When I dared to look back a moment later, he had picked up his book again, his attention seemingly fixed on the page. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that his attention wasn't on the book. It was on me. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things, with questions I was too afraid to ask, and answers he was too reserved to give. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the library floor, I knew it was time to pack up for the day. I had made good progress, but there was still more to do. The piano was not just out of tune. Some of the key mechanisms felt sluggish, a deeper issue that would require more delicate work. I started carefully placing my tools back into their felt-lined slots. Arthur set his book aside and rose from his chair, stretching slowly like a large, contented cat. He walked over to the piano, his steps nearly silent on the thick Persian rug. He stood beside me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap and the crisp cotton of his sweater. My pulse quickened. "You've made a remarkable difference already," he said, his voice a low rumble beside me. "I haven't heard it sound so clear in years. It's a well-made instrument." I replied, my focus on securing the lid of my toolbox. It just needed some attention. He reached out, his fingers gently pressing one of the keys I had just tuned. A single, perfect C-sharp filled the air. Then, he pointed to a key in the upper register. "This one still feels a bit stiff," he noted. His hand, large and steady, hovered just above the keyboard. To show him what I meant about the sluggish mechanism, I placed my own hand on the keys, intending to demonstrate the slow return. As I did, his hand moved at the same time, our fingers brushing. The contact was fleeting, a bare whisper of skin against skin, but it sent a jolt straight through me. It was like striking a live wire. I froze, my hand hovering over the keys. He didn't pull back. For a long, suspended moment, his hand stayed where it was, his index finger resting lightly against mine. The point of contact was a small, intense point of heat. I looked up at him. His gaze was fixed on our hands, his expression thoughtful. Then he slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. The air crackled. The world seemed to narrow to the few inches of space between us. I saw something in his eyes then, a flicker of the same startling awareness that was coursing through me. It wasn't pity or polite interest. It was something deeper, something that acknowledged the charge between us. The moment stretched, taut, and fragile. Then, as slowly as he had initiated the contact, he withdrew his hand. "I see," he said, his voice a fraction thicker than before. "It will require more work." "Then yes," I managed to say, my own voice husky. "A bit more." He gave a slight nod, stepping back and restoring a more comfortable distance between us. The spell was broken, but the echo of it remained, shimmering in the air. I finished packing my tools, my movements clumsy, my mind replaying that single, searing touch. It had been nothing, a simple accident. But my heart, which had been so quiet for so long, was pounding a frantic, undeniable rhythm against my ribs. It had been everything. The next day, I returned with a new sense of trepidation. The memory of that touch had followed me home, weaving itself into my dreams. I worried I had imagined the intensity of the moment, that I was projecting my own loneliness onto a simple, kind man. But when Arthur opened the door, the look in his eyes told me I hadn't imagined it. There was a new watchfulness there, a subtle tension in the set of his shoulders. The easy, professional space we had occupied the day before was gone, replaced by a charged awareness. He led me back to the library. "I made coffee," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Would you like a cup?" It was an offer of normalcy, an attempt to smooth over the disruption from the day before. I accepted, grateful for the simple ritual. We stood in his kitchen for a few moments, the gleaming stainless steel and dark granite a stark contrast to my own worn-out rental. He handed me a heavy ceramic mug, our fingers brushing again as I took it. This time, the touch was expected, but no less potent. We both chose to ignore it. Back in the library, I got to work on the sluggish key mechanism. It was a delicate operation. A small felt damper was misaligned, and the jack that propelled the hammer was sticking. It required taking a part of the piano's action out, a complex wooden assembly of levers and hammers. As I worked to carefully extract it, I realized I needed a third hand. I needed someone to hold the assembly steady while I loosened a particularly stubborn screw. I tried to manage on my own for several minutes, contorting myself into an awkward position, my frustration growing. I didn't want to ask him for help. It felt like an imposition, a breach of the professional boundary I was so desperately trying to reinforce. But the screw wouldn't budge, and I risked damaging the delicate wooden parts if I forced it. Arthur must have been watching me struggle. I heard him set his book down with a soft thud. "Do you need some assistance, Leo?" he asked, his voice calm and even. I finally gave in, a flush of embarrassment warming my cheeks. "Actually, yes. I just need someone to hold this section steady for a moment. It's a bit awkward to do alone." He came over immediately, no hesitation. "Show me where," he said. I guided his hands to the wooden frame of the action assembly. His hands were large and strong, yet they settled on the fragile mechanism with an innate gentleness, the hands of an architect who understood structure and stress. He held it perfectly still, his knuckles just inches from my own as I worked the screwdriver. We were side by side, our shoulders almost touching. I was intensely aware of his proximity, of the subtle scent of his cologne, of the soft sound of his breathing. I focused on the screw, trying to ignore the way my skin tingled. Under the steady pressure of his hands, the screw finally gave way with a small creak. "Got it," I murmured, a wave of relief washing over me. "Thank you, of course," he said, but he didn't move away. We remained there for a moment, kneeling together by the heart of the piano, the complex wooden machinery exposed between us. It felt intimate, like we were sharing a secret. "My wife, Eleanor, she loved this piano," he said suddenly, his voice soft and reflective. "She picked it out at an estate sale. Said it had character." He ran a finger gently over one of the wooden hammers. "She didn't get to play it for very long. She got sick not long after we bought it." I stopped what I was doing, my screwdriver resting on the screw head. This was a piece of his history, a glimpse behind the stoic facade. I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," was all I could offer, the words feeling small and inadequate. He looked at me, a sad, gentle smile touching his lips. It was a long time ago, but the silence she left behind. It lingers. Having you here, bringing music back into the house. It's a good feeling. He paused, his gaze becoming more direct, more serious. "I want you to know, Leo," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "that my intentions in hiring you were straightforward. To have the piano fixed for the charity event." He took a breath, as if steeling himself. "But I find myself enjoying your company. More than his strictly professional, he looked down at his hands, which were still resting on the piano's action. I am aware of our differences. My age, my position in this town. The last thing I would ever want is for you to feel pressured or for this arrangement to feel transactional. Your comfort here is my primary concern. If I have overstepped in any way, you must tell me. His confession hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable. He was naming the power imbalance that had been a silent third party in the room since I arrived. He was giving me all the control, laying his cards on the table and waiting for me to play mine. It was an act of profound respect. He wasn't testing me. He was opening a door and assuring me I was under no obligation to walk through it. My heart ached with a feeling I couldn't name. It was relief and gratitude and a soaring, terrifying hope. He saw it. He saw the potential for complication, and instead of ignoring it or using it, he was addressing it with gentle honesty. You haven't overstepped, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Arthur, you haven't. I met his gaze, holding it, trying to pour all of my unspoken feelings into that one look. Thank you for saying that. A visible wave of relief passed over his features. The tension in his shoulders eased. He gave me a small, slow nod, and a genuine smile. The first I had truly seen from him lit up his face. It transformed him, chasing away the shadows of grief and reserve, making him look younger, more open. In that moment, kneeling on the floor beside the guts of an old piano, something fundamental shifted between us. We were no longer just a client and a contractor. We were two men, navigating the delicate, hopeful beginning of something new. We finished the repair in a comfortable, charged silence. The work itself, the shared task, became a way to communicate without words. Our hands brushed again, more than once. Neither of us flinched away. Each touch was a quiet acknowledgement of the conversation we'd just had, a confirmation that we were on the same page. When the action was back in place and the key worked perfectly, I played a soft, rising arpeggio. The notes rang out, clear and bright, filling the library with a sound that felt like a promise. The following days settled into a new rhythm. The tension was still there, but it was different. It was no longer the sharp edge of uncertainty, but the warm, humming anticipation of something wonderful. We talked more. He told me about his work as an architect, about the buildings he'd designed. I told him about my old workshop, about the joy I found in bringing broken things back to life. We discovered a shared appreciation for craftsmanship, for things built with care and meant to last. One afternoon, as I was packing up to leave, an older man I recognized from the neighborhood was walking his dog past the house. He saw me coming out the front door and paused, a nosy, curious look on his face. It was Mr. Abernathy, a notorious town gossip. "Afternoon, Miller," he called out, his voice a little too loud. "Looks like Gray is keeping you busy over there." Finally bringing some life back into that old mausoleum. The word mausoleum was laced with a certain pitying condescension, but his eyes, as they flicked from me back to the house, held a sharper, more speculative glint. I felt a hot flush of anger and embarrassment. The implication was clear, painting me as some sort of project, or worse, an opportunist. "I'm just tuning the piano," I said stiffly, my hand tightening on the handle of my toolbox. Just then, the front door opened again, and Arthur stepped out onto the porch. He had obviously heard the exchange. He stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, and I felt a sudden dread. I worried he would be embarrassed, that this public scrutiny would make him retreat back behind his careful walls. But he didn't. He walked down the porch steps and stood beside me, a solid, unwavering presence. He looked directly at Abernathy, his gaze cool and direct. "Leo is a gifted craftsman," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel that brooked no argument. "His work is greatly appreciated." He didn't raise his voice, but the message was unmistakable. It was a dismissal. Mr. Abernathy, to his credit, seemed to shrink a little under that steady gaze. Of course," he muttered, tugging on his dog's leash. "Just making conversation." He gave a curt nod and hurried on his way. The silence he left behind felt heavy. Arthur's defense of me, his quiet, public act of protection, made my heart pound. He hadn't just defended my work, he had stood with me. He had aligned himself with me against the casual judgment of the outside world. I turned to him, wanting to thank him, but the words caught in my throat. He was looking at me, his expression softening from the cool dismissal he'd given Abernathy into something warm and concerned. "Don't pay him any mind," he said quietly. "This town has a long memory and a short imagination. Thank you," I finally managed to say. He simply nodded, but his eyes held mine. That protective gesture had made something undeniable clear. His feelings for me weren't just a private matter, confined to the quiet library. He was willing to own them, at least in this small way. The silence that followed was charged with everything that had just happened, with everything that had been building between us. Later that afternoon, after I had returned to my work, the incident with Abernathy lingered in the air. I found myself making small mistakes, my concentration shot. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Arthur had stood beside me, a quiet shield. He must have sensed my distraction. He came and stood by the piano, watching my hands as I tried to voice one of the hammers. My movements were clumsy, uncertain. "People will always draw their own conclusions," he said softly, his voice picking up the thread of our earlier, interrupted moment on the porch. "The only ones that matter are ours." He paused, and the weight of that pause was immense. He was creating a space for me, for us. "Leo," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "is there anything you want to ask me?" The question was a direct invitation. It was the key to the lock I had placed on my own heart. He wasn't going to push, wasn't going to assume. He was asking for my consent, not just for a physical step, but for an emotional one. He was asking me to be brave. I take a breath. It feels like the first full breath I've taken in years. The air fills my lungs, steadying me. This is it. This is the moment where I either step forward or retreat back into the safe, gray silence of my life. I turn on the piano bench to face him fully. He is standing so close, a bastion of quiet strength. I can see the flecks of gray and blue in his eyes, the deep lines of kindness etched at their corners. I see the question there, and the hope. I think. I begin, and my voice is a reed in the wind, trembling but holding, that I would like for there to be in us to have conclusions. The words come out, clumsy and earnest, but they are the truest words I have ever spoken. For a moment, Arthur just looks at me, his expression unreadable. A flicker of panic goes through me. Did I misread everything? Did I push too far? Then, the careful mask of composure he wears so well dissolves. It melts away, replaced by a look of such profound relief and tenderness that it steals my breath. A slow, beautiful smile spreads across his face, reaching all the way to his eyes. The steady, reserved Mr. Gray is gone, and in his place is just Arthur, a man who has been waiting, patiently, for me to meet him halfway. He steps closer, closing the final inch of space between us. He doesn't rush. Every movement is deliberate, a testament to his patient nature. "I would like that too, Leo," he says, his voice a low, intimate murmur that seems to vibrate right through me. "More than you know." He lifts a hand, not to my shoulder in a friendly gesture, but to my face. His palm is warm against my cheek, his thumb stroking the line of my jaw with an unbelievable gentleness. The gesture is so full of care, so reverent, that my eyes flutter shut for a second. I lean into his touch, a silent surrender. When I open my eyes again, he is looking at me with an intensity that makes my soul feel bare. Then he leans in. The kiss, when it comes, is not a collision of passion, but a moment of quiet arrival. It's a question and an answer all at once. His lips are soft, firm, and they taste faintly of coffee and of him. It is a kiss of certainty, of rightness. It is unhurried and unforced, a slow, deep claiming that feels less like a beginning and more like a homecoming. It's the feeling of a lock turning, of a long-closed door swinging open onto a sunlit room. He pulls back just enough to rest his forehead against mine. I can feel his breath on my lips, warm and steady. My own breathing is ragged. I lift my hands, not sure what to do with them, and he captures one of them, his fingers lacing through mine. His grip is firm, reassuring. We stand there like that for a long time, in the quiet library, with the scent of old books and lemon oil around us, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows. The weight of all the unspoken things between us has finally lifted, leaving behind a light, bright, and boundless sense of peace. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, the pale gray light of dawn filtering through my thin curtains. For a disorienting moment, I wondered if I had dreamt at all. The memory of the kiss, of the warmth of Arthur's hand in mine, felt too good, too perfect to be real. A familiar anxiety began to prickle at the edges of my newfound peace. What now? What did this mean? I arrived at his house at my usual time, my stomach in a knot of uncertainty. I felt like a teenager after a first date, overanalyzing every possible meaning. When Arthur opened the door, his expression was as calm and composed as ever. He was dressed in his usual neat trousers and a soft, cream-colored sweater. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to pretend nothing had happened. "Good morning, Leo," he said, his voice its usual steady baritone. "Coffee is ready." The formality, which had once been comforting, now felt like a chasm between us. I followed him into the kitchen, my earlier hope deflating with every step. I had been a fool. He was a wealthy, established man, and I was me. A brief, impulsive moment in his quiet library was all it was ever going to be. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, his movements as precise as always. He handed one to me. But instead of leading me back to the library to work, he gestured to the 2 comfortable armchairs near the fireplace in the adjoining sitting room. "Sit with me for a moment," he said. I sat, perching on the edge of the cushion, the warm mug a fragile anchor in my sea of doubt. He sat opposite me, not behind a desk or across a vast room, but close. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes thoughtful as he looked at me over the rim of his mug. "Leo," he began, his voice low and serious. "Last night was not a fleeting thing for me." The directness of his statement startled me. He met my gaze, his own clear and unwavering. "I want to be very clear about that. But I also want to be clear about something else." He set his mug down on the small table between us. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely between the 2 of us, "this new development changes nothing about our professional arrangement unless you want it to. The piano is still your job. Your independence is yours. I am not your patron, and you are not my project." He was addressing the very fears that were swirling in my head, naming them before I could even voice them. "I have a key for you," he continued, pulling a single, brass key from his pocket and placing it on the table. "For the house. So you can come and go as you need to for your work, without feeling like you have to report to me. Your schedule is your own. There are no expectations attached to this, or to us, beyond honesty." The sight of that key lying on the polished wood was more reassuring than any flowery declaration of affection could ever be. It was a practical, tangible symbol of his respect for my autonomy. It was trust. It was an offer of partnership, not possession. The knot of anxiety in my stomach slowly, miraculously, began to unwind. I reached out and picked up the key. It was heavy and cool in my palm. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." He reached across the small space and placed his hand over mine, his fingers warm and strong around my own. "I want to build something with you, Leo," he said quietly. "Something steady. And steady things need a solid foundation." His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a simple, grounding touch that sealed his words. In that moment, all my fears about the power imbalance, about what people might think, seemed to fade into insignificance. All that mattered was the warm, reassuring weight of his hand on mine, and the quiet promise of a foundation we could build together. The next Saturday, he asked if I would accompany him to the local farmer's market. It was a small thing, a normal weekend errand, but it felt like a significant step. To be seen with him, not as his piano tuner but as his companion, was to make our private understanding public. I agreed, a flutter of nerves and excitement in my chest. The market was bustling with people, the air filled with the scent of fresh produce and baking bread. It felt good to be there with him, to be part of the town's gentle weekend rhythm. We walked side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing. He would point out a vendor known for the best corn, and I would point out the intricate carvings on an old wooden stall. It was easy. It was comfortable. And then, inevitably, we saw Mr. Abernathy heading our way. My stomach tightened. I instinctively took a small step away from Arthur, a foolish, ingrained habit of making myself smaller, less visible. But Arthur, seeming to sense my retreat, did the opposite. He moved closer. "Arthur Miller," Abernathy called out, his gaze bouncing between us with undisguised curiosity. This time, before Abernathy could make some snide remark, Arthur spoke. "Good morning, Charles," he said, his tone pleasant but firm. He then did something that made my heart stop. He gently placed his hand on the small of my back, a simple, possessive, and utterly public gesture. You've met my friend, Leo. I believe the word friend was spoken with a warmth and emphasis that left no room for misinterpretation. The hand on my back was a clear, unambiguous statement. We are together. Mr. Abernathy's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He saw the hand, he heard the tone, and for once, he seemed at a loss for words. Ah, yes. Friend, he stammered, his gaze dropping away. Well, lovely day for the market. He scurried off without another word. Arthur's hand remained on my back, a warm, steady pressure. He leaned in slightly, his voice for my ears only. Are you all right? I looked up at him, a slow smile spreading across my face. I felt a surge of pride, of gratitude. He hadn't hidden me. He hadn't flinched. He had stood by me, claimed me, in the middle of our town square. I was no longer a secret. I'm more than all right, I said, my voice full of a confidence that felt brand new. I'm perfect, he smiled back, a real, unguarded smile, and for the rest of the morning, his hand never strayed far from mine. A few days later, I placed the last tool back in my case. The piano was finished. The keys were perfectly weighted, the hammers voiced, the strings stretched and settled into a stable, beautiful tune. I played a final, lingering chord, and the music filled the library, rich and whole. The job that had brought me into Arthur's life was done. A sudden, sharp pang of sadness hit me. What now? Arthur had been listening from his armchair. When the final note faded, he was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice quiet. It has never sounded so beautiful. Thank you, Leo, you're welcome, I said, closing the piano lid with a soft click. The sound felt final. He stood up and walked over to me. He didn't stand beside me. He stood in front of me, blocking my path, forcing me to look at him. This isn't the end of something, he said, as if reading my mind. It's the end of the beginning. He took my hand. I have a proposition for you. A real 1-inch. He led me out of the library, through the house, and out a back door I hadn't used before. We walked across a neat stone patio to a small, separate building I'd noticed before but hadn't paid much attention to. It was an old carriage house, with large barn-style doors and a sleeping loft. He slid one of the heavy doors open. The inside was dusty and filled with forgotten things. Old furniture under white sheets, stacks of crates, garden tools. But it was a magnificent space, with high ceilings, exposed wooden beams, and a huge window that flooded the room with northern light. I know you miss your workshop, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. This place has been sitting empty for decades. The light is good. It's solid. He turned to me, his expression serious. I would like to hire you, properly this time, on a retainer. There are a dozen things in this house that need a restorer's touch. Old furniture, a grandfather clock that hasn't chimed in years. We could turn this into your workshop, a place for you to create things again. We can draw up a contract, make it all official. It would be a partnership. Your skill, my space. I was speechless. He wasn't just offering me odd jobs. He was offering me a chance to rebuild my life, my career, right here. He was offering me a place, a purpose. He saw the work I loved, the skill that defined me, and he was making a space for it, for me, in his world. Tears pricked my eyes. Arthur, I whispered, my voice thick. Think about it, he said gently. There's no pressure. It's just an idea, but I didn't need to think about it. I saw it all clearly, a future where I wasn't just visiting his home, but where I belonged in it. A future filled with the scent of sawdust and wood varnish, with the quiet satisfaction of making broken things whole again. A future with him. Yes, I said, the word coming out on a choked sob of pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, Arthur. I would love that. The following Sunday morning felt like the first day of the rest of my life. I had stayed the night, not in a guest room, but in his room, in his bed. Waking up to the sight of him sleeping beside me, his face peaceful in the early morning light, was a revelation. The quiet intimacy of it settled something deep inside me. We went downstairs to the kitchen, the room already bright with sunlight. Without discussion, we fell into an easy, domestic rhythm. He ground the coffee beans while I took out the eggs and butter. He moved around the familiar space with an easy grace, and I found myself navigating around him, a silent dance of two people who were learning each other's movements. He handed me a warm mug of coffee, our fingers brushing in what was now a familiar, comforting gesture. The silence wasn't empty or tense. It was full. It was the companionable silence of two people who are so comfortable in each other's presence that words are unnecessary. It felt more profound, more real, than any grand, romantic gesture. This was not a spectacle. This was life. After breakfast, we stood together on the back porch, mugs in hand, watching the sun climb higher over the lush green of his garden. He stood behind me, his arms wrapped loosely around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. I leaned back against the solid warmth of his chest, feeling utterly safe, completely at home. I thought about the man I was just a few weeks ago, the man who lived in a silent apartment, carving tiny, flightless birds. My world had been so small, so carefully contained. I had built walls around my heart to protect it, but all I had done was create a prison. Arthur hadn't torn those walls down. He had simply opened the door and waited patiently for me to find the courage to walk through it. The difference in our ages, in our wealth, in our life experiences, all the things I had once seen as insurmountable barriers, seemed so insignificant now. They were just facts, just context. They were part of the landscape of our lives, but they were not a cage. The foundation he had spoken of wasn't built on money or status. It was built on mutual respect, on quiet care, and on the simple, profound act of truly seeing another person. He wasn't my savior. He was my partner. He hadn't rescued me from my life. He had joined me in it, and in doing so, had made my world expansive and bright with possibility. The steady, quiet man I had admired from afar was now the steady, quiet man whose arms were wrapped around me, whose steady heartbeat I could feel against my back. I was no longer adrift. I was anchored. He tilted his head, his lips brushing my temple. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. I smiled, a real, contented smile that came from the deepest part of me. I turned my head to kiss him, a slow, easy kiss that tasted of coffee and the promise of 1,000 more Sunday mornings just like this one. "Nothing," I said, looking out at the sun-drenched garden that was now, somehow, our garden. And everything, share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.